we were speaking about the Ramchal. He's coming to explain that the purpose and the objective of creation of our existence is to achieve perfection. What is perfection? Perfection is to achieve a level that we're able to cleave to God himself, Hashem being the source of all goodness, and God being perfect on the absolute level. So if we achieve perfection within ourselves, then we're qualified to cleave to the source of all goodness, and ultimately will be the beneficiaries of the ultimate good. That's the concept. But he says, what is that? What is perfection? What is the lack of perfection? He says, only once you achieve perfection do you understand what a lack of perfection is. So I gave you an example. If you have all humanity are born handicapped with two hands, but each hand has two fingers. So everybody believes that being a whole person normal means you're supposed to have three fingers on every hand. And then they come across a community which each hand has five fingers, not three. And they, as a result of it, they realize a more functional person is the person that has five fingers rather than three fingers on each hand. So you only understand what you're lacking when you understand what you're supposed to be. You only understand what perfection is when you achieve it, and only in retrospect you realize what it means, what is lacking perfection. But ultimately, to appreciate what perfection is not possible to fathom in the physical existence. Why? Because in the physical existence, we live at a location which is distant from the source, which is God himself. God is totally spiritual. The world is a physical world. Only when the world will be totally spiritual will we process and relate to things within a spiritual context. For instance, what is the world to come? Person passes away is worthy of the world to come. What is it? You can only fathom and understand something and relate to something only if it's within your lexicon. We live a physical life. We understand what is not acceptable. To really understand what spirituality is, it's not fathomable. We speak about pleasure or pain. We speak about the Talmud based on psukim, verses, and prophecies. We speak about the fires of spiritual hell. You realize there's no fire in hell. Fire is a physical part of physical existence. But the only way we're able to communicate the extreme level of suffering in the world to come, we say it's the equivalent of that. But is it experienced as that? It's not experienced as that. It's an experience with the spiritual realm, but the only way we can have an inkling of what that is to depict it in the physical, on the most extreme level of suffering within the physical. We speak about pleasure. It's indescribable. If we say that if you do one mitzvah, there's not enough reward, we'd have a capacity to benefit from the one mitzvah in terms of its innate value. So if you multiply that endless times over, could you relate? If you can't relate to one mitzvah, and that's why you can't be rewarded in this world, because there's not enough good, enough time to experience that goodness, that means it's beyond our capacity. But we have an inkling of what that is. It's the ultimate. What's the ultimate? It's beyond. Identically, to understand what deficiency in spirituality is and what accomplishment is, to be able to sense what that is, we have no idea what that is. But we know the Torah prescribes that if you do and observe the 248 positive commandments and you don't transgress the negative commandments and you serve God for the sake of God without any ulterior motive, it generates and brings about an effect and advances your soul and completes your soul, that ultimately you're worthy to cleave to God himself, because you achieve that level of perfection within yourself. What is it? We don't know what it is, but it's achieved through the observance and the performance of the mitzvos, of the commandments as God prescribed them to be. That's where we're at right now. So now the question is, God could have created a more perfect world. He could have created us with greater levels of capability. But he reined in on those energies to create it with the limitation we have, because only within the context of that limitation, to that degree that we're limited, we're able to be the beneficiaries ultimately of the greatest level of benefit. Because otherwise he could have created differently. But again, we don't understand. It's beyond human intelligence, beyond our capacity, even to be able to have an inkling of the understanding of what God's mind is. You know, I always say, if a believing Jew, he believes in the truth and the innate value of mitzvos. He goes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I understand God wants us to keep kosher. Could you explain to me why? That if you have a kosher species, and even though it chews its cud and has split hooves, but if it's not ritually slaughtered, and the meat is not prepared as prescribed by the Torah to extract the blood, and so on and so forth, it's not kosher. You're not permitted. Why? Rabbi, could you explain to me why? Rabbi says, I'm sorry, I can't, but that's what it says, but why? But it's, I want to know why. But we understand, why did God create the world in a very limited context? Why does a person have a maximum 300 IQ? You could have a 20 million IQ. Because God is infinite. He could do anything. Could you explain it? Can't explain it. Because unless you're God's mind and you have God's capacity to appreciate something, you have an understanding. So what do you want to understand what kosher is? Kosher is part of that same infinite wisdom. Why he created? He could have created a greater world, but he created a world with limitation, with this level of deficiency. So only within this context is our end result greater level of perfection than if it would have been created in a different capacity. Why? Because that's what God created it. That's the answer. But I want to know, could you explain to me Einstein's theory of relativity? I'm not a physicist. I don't have that kind of IQ. So if you can't explain to me Einstein's theory of relativity, you want me to explain to you what the reason God gave, where God didn't reveal his reason, because it's beyond human capacity, and nobody in the history of this existence ever understood it unless God would explain it to him. So where are you coming from? The whole thing is foolishness. But that's the reality. It's literally the exact same thing. You know, it's interesting. Person says to me, this item costs so much. If you want it, you pay that much. She say, but why does it cost so much? Because that's the price tag I put on it. There you have a prerogative. You have to pay for it. You don't appreciate its value, don't buy it. Don't buy it. That's it. But God, in our situation, if I don't say it, I'm not doing it. You know, why do you walk this forsaken earth? Why do you exist in this forsaken existence? It is forsaken if you don't utilize it as you should. Why am I here? Because God willed I should. Why am I alive? Because God willed I'm alive. Why does God give me my function? To be able to make choices. So I should make the choice, but it's up to me. See, even what you give, it's not yours. God gives you the means to act and be in a situation of choice to take initiatives. So it's not like purchasing something. It's my money. I have a right to make my decision. You have no right. You may believe you have the right. So therefore, God says this is the purpose of the world. You want to be smart? Take advantage of opportunity. You want to be foolish? Then you'll actually not only not advance yourself, you'll diminish yourself, and you'll be culpable for failing. That's what life's all about. You know, there's an expression in English. We don't hear these expressions any longer. As you make your bed, that's the way you sleep. That's life. In the words of the Talmud, the one who prepares Erev Shabbos, you eat on Shabbos. You didn't prepare for Shabbos, then you have nothing to eat on Shabbos. The world to come is called Shabbos. It's the world where you don't have to take initiative there. Everything comes to a standstill. There you reap the benefits of your whole life. If you prepared Friday, Erev Shabbos, then you eat on Shabbos. You chose not to, you have nobody to blame but yourself. And that's the reality of life. So again, well, I have a right. The truth is you have no right. God allows you to believe you have a right. And therefore that's part of our choice, to be the ultimate beneficiaries that we make the right choice. The right choice is purely dependent on ourselves. So we should maximize on making that choice, because we could have made a contrary choice, which would have not been in conformance with the will of God. A person is tremendously successful in life, one of a kind of success. And because that he believes people should acknowledge him, and he wants to be in center stage. Everybody should acknowledge him, sing his praises, so on and so forth. And he believes he deserves it, and people should, and they have to. What happens the moment he dies? How long does it take that when he becomes history, nobody even knows he even existed? How long does it take to forget about that person? Once his money is distributed and nobody has to even think about him, nobody thinks about him any longer. That's the end of him. So how fickle, what is the innate value of you being acknowledged, other than your function to do the right thing? What's the value of ego? Well, I think I should get the attention. And if you don't get the attention, you'll destroy the world. Or I won't do the right thing. What's the value of getting attention? Well, I think I deserve it. Because I am so special. So if you're so special, you're so integral to existence, why the moment you vacate this existence, you're not even a trace of memory? That's most people. Why? Mr. Glick used to have a good expression. He said, and really it's a chazal. It's a chazal based on the words of Shlomo Melech in Koheles. Shlomo Melech in Koheles writes that he envies the dead over the living. He's the wisest man who ever lived. He envies the dead over the living. Why? He envies the living. Over the person dies, it's over. But he envies the dead over the living. So he explains. So the Midrash says, what is it analogous to? They build this big, very large ship. And it's about its first voyage out to sea. What happens? People gather at the dock. They have all kinds of speeches, bands playing, people excited. They take a bottle of champagne, break it on its hole. The ship goes out to sea. And everybody's excited. Does anybody know whether that ship's coming back? Maybe that ship is going to experience some kind of accident and it's going to sink at sea. Who said it's coming back? A child is born. Everybody's excited. Why are you excited? Because there's a potential. Because nobody knows what kind of choices and what that child's life is going to be. As he grows and develops childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and what's going to be his imprint on life, on the world. So when the person dies, in retrospect, you're able to quantify what the value of that life is. When a person dies, you know exactly what he achieved, what he accomplished. When a person's born, it's all potential. If he actualized that potential, then you rejoice, and then you see that person's life had that special value. But if the person's life was wasted, not only wasted, but it created total havoc and destruction, and whatever that is, there's nothing to be excited about that child when he was born. Only now would he realize it was a disaster. And the Gemara says, it would have been better for man not to be created than created, if that's the way the person, the end result is. That's the Midrash explaining Shlomo Melech. He envies the dead over the living. At the end of one's life, you could quantify the life. At the beginning, you have no idea where that person's going. Years ago, photographers, when they videoed weddings, going back the 60s and the 70s. So in those years, they would take films. This is even before the video. And they would add certain things to the wedding, the beginning of the wedding, pre-chuppah, chuppah, the actual wedding, the celebrations, the dancing, and then the closing blessings of the wedding. And then the bride and groom, they'd walk away, they walk out of the hall. And the photographer would film them, and they would say, "This is just the beginning." You got it. The end of the wedding is just the beginning. It's not the end. Now they're starting to embark on life. That's what life is all about. The wedding is only the prerequisite. That's the launch pad. Not a question is where you're launching to. Are you going to soar? Are you going to create that special family? Are you invest your abilities together to create something which is special? Or God forbid, you may make terrible decisions due to many reasons that you should have made those decisions. But that's exactly what life's all about. And that's exactly what King Solomon says in Proverbs, in Koheles, I envy the dead over the living. What people believe is accomplishment, maybe at best, passe, mediocrity at the most extreme level of mediocrity. Mediocrity, only God knows. Like person say to me, "Is he a tzaddik?" I said, only God can make that evaluation. Who is, who's not? Do we know who? Do we not know what people's intentions are? There are many things we don't even know about people's lives. They may have done things in privacy which are exceptional, and they outshine what most people have done. Nobody knows what they did. But factually, when do you quantify a person's life? When I say when, we don't quantify anybody's life. God is the one who makes that evaluation. But factually, if a person grew up to be, God forbid, a criminal, and he dies in Alcatraz or in Sing Sing, we know he didn't die at tzaddik, that's for sure. Because usually people are classified as devoutly righteous. They're not spending time in a synagogue, in the bowels of Sing Sing and Alcatraz. He's not there. So we have a gist of an idea of in what direction a person took in life. Exactly where in life, what was the accomplishment? Only God knows. The Rambam writes in the Laws of Tshuva, how do you classify a tzaddik? Or how does God classify a tzaddik? So based on the Talmud, Rambam writes that the majority of one's accomplishments are positive and the minority are negative, that person's a tzaddik. Nobody's perfect. But as long as the majority are positive, you're a tzaddik. If God forbid the majority are negative, then the person is classified as a Russian. So Rambam says, I want to explain you something. This is not a quantitative evaluation, it's qualitative. And he explains, you could have one mitzvah which is so immense and so special, it counters endless transgressions. So when you put it on that scale, although quantitatively you may have more negative than positive, but since qualitatively this one action is so special, it outweighs everything, and that's evaluated as the majority, and the person classified as tzaddik. And you could have one sin which is so extremely negative, and you have multiple positive, it could outweigh all the positive. So this evaluation, who is the one who makes this evaluation? The one who knows it all, God himself. We don't pass judgment. We don't make evaluations of other people. Not at all, because you never know what the reality is. But we can have an inkling of what something is, that if a person keeps nothing and believes in nothing and only does bad and doesn't do good, probably we have a good idea of where that person stands. We're not passing judgment on him. It's irrelevant. Do I want to have a relationship with that kind of person? The answer is no. You have a right not to have a relationship with that person because his behavior clearly identifies him as the way you're supposed to see a person like that. And you see a person doing very good things. He's probably a good person. To what degree is he good? To make that absolute exact evaluation, we're not able to do. Only God could. But we have a right to classify people related to ourselves. Many years ago, my father, Ramchal, it was a question, he was ambidextrous. So he's supposed to wear your tefillin on the weaker hand. So when he was born in 1921, when he was 13 years old, his grandparents already lived in Yerushalayim. When he was bar mitzvah, his grandparents sent him a pair of tefillin from Yerushalayim to St. Louis, Missouri. His grandparents had come to St. Louis, Missouri in the 1880s. And his grandfather and grandmother, they retired they were older people, and they were very wealthy people, and they left behind the largest dairy in the Midwest for their family to run. And he lived out his years in the old Jerusalem. And he sent Pierre tefillin, and there was a question because how should he put on tefillin? So he would put on tefillin. It was ruled by the rabbis in those years, he should put tefillin on both hands, meaning he should put tefillin on his left hand, and towards the end of davening, he should take tefillin off his left hand, put it on his right hand. So he wore tefillin on both hands. By the end of davening, the prayer service, he wore tefillin on both hands. So one of my sons has a similar situation, and we asked Rebbe Yoshev, Zech Tzaddik Livrocha, what he should do, and he gave the exact same ruling, that he should wear tefillin on his left hand till Ashrei at the end of davening, and Ashrei takes him off, puts it on his right hand, and he wears the tefillin on his right hand. Because it's a question which is the weaker hand of the two, because he does certain things with his right hand, does other things with his left hand. He writes with one hand, but he does many chores with his other hand. Okay, that's not the question. I wanted the punchline. My father every single day used to finish Tillim when he was older, when in 80s, 60s and up. He would finish the whole book of Tillim every day, he would say. My father-in-law, he was a first-class businessman. He didn't look Jewish, didn't have a Jewish look. He was a redhead. He looked like an Irishman. And when he dressed, he would wear very often a red sport jacket, a green beret, and an open shirt. And he was a very devout religious man. He's finishing saying Tillim at the Kotel or the Koso. And a Chabad person comes over to him and says to him, "Are you Jewish?" That's the first question they ask him. "Are you Jewish?" He says, "Yeah, I'm Jewish." He says, "Do you put on tefillin today?" He says, "Of course I put on tefillin." So what are you talking about? You put on tefillin the way he looks. He didn't look like he's a Jew who puts on tefillin. He says, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I'll show you." He rolls up both sleeves. He has tefillin strap marks on both arms. He says, "Did I put on tefillin?" He shows both arms. He has tefillin marks on both arms. Here's the story. You understand? So how do you evaluate a person? He looks like barely Jewish. Maybe he's not Jewish. Now he is Jewish. Did you put on tefillin? So could we pass judgment on anybody? Can't pass judgment on anybody. Would you want to marry his daughter if you don't know who he is? The answer is no, until you do your research to find out who he is. So that's the same thing. But if at the end of the day, you are that special person, only God knows how special you are, then that person, you envy the dead over the living. Just tell you a little bit about my father-in-law, Allah Shalom. My father was an officer in the United States Navy during World War II. You know, when in the Army, you know, you have a lieutenant, colonel, first lieutenant, second lieutenant, colonel, brigadier general, general, first star. Okay, in the Navy, he was a double ensign in the Navy during World War II. And he was based in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. That's what he was. My father was always an observant Jew, always. But he wasn't what we call Talmid Chacham. He was observant. And if you don't study, although you're observant, but you could be always more observant because you'll be more meticulous in your observance because you're more knowledgeable. But he was always, according to he was in those days, in the 30s, 40s, he was considered an observant Jew, based on what an observant Jew was in those days. So he knew more than he was an officer. He lived in the officers' quarters. No ship could go out to the Pacific after it was loaded up in Cuba. It was a naval base, unless he signed off on the order. That's the position he had. Very significant position. And most of the war, he played polo. He was an officer in the, on Guantanamo Bay. All he had to do, they brought him the orders, the captains of the frigates, the battleships, this. He would check it, sign it off. They would go out to the Pacific. There were about 1,000 Jewish sailors in Guantanamo Bay, or maybe 700, who were there. My father made a Seder for them. My father conducted the Seder. So how do you have, and he built a shul in Guantanamo Bay during the war. Cuba, I didn't know till he told me, has mahogany trees. So he built a synagogue, an Aron Kodesh. No, money wasn't an issue. You needed carpenters, cabinet makers. You had them in the army, in the Navy. They built them, or the people, the locals, the domestics in Cuba, they built them a beautiful Aron Kodesh, beautiful furniture for a shul. They outfitted a shul. And he had services during World War II in Guantanamo Bay. They had a Seder. They had 1,000 sailors, because even the non-Jewish sailors came to the Seder. My father conducted the Seder. They needed wine for the Seder. My father didn't know much. So there was a monastery up in the hills where they produced wine. So he brought him wine from the monastery, which was, of course, not kosher wine. It was made by non-Jews. That's the wine they drank in 4 cups during the Seder. Understand? But of course, he meant well. Comes back after the war. He realizes, comes back to St. Louis, unless there's there wasn't much Judaism for the new generation. So what he did, the first thing he did with a few of his friends, they built a Young Israel. The Young Israel in 1945, 46, was an Orthodox for the young people. Because in those days, unless you were an older person, they didn't even let you go pray for the Ummah, to represent the congregation. There was no singing, there was nothing. So unless they did something to attract young people to come to shul, people are not going to synagogue. He built that Young Israel. He built the day school. He built the girls' school. He built a kollel. He built the aguda. Whatever exists today in St. Louis is because of what he did. This is with his paltry Jewish background. He was able to do all this. Plus, he did many other things. You looked at him, he looked like an ordinary guy. Ordinary guy. But if you go and do research and what he accomplished and how many people learn in yeshiva today and how people are observant because of what he did, what he sacrificed, and what he had to stand up against because there was such a opposition to him. We're running away from that. You want to bring back the past, archaic behavior, this and that. Plus, even the observant Jews who are wealthy, you're a young whippersnapper. Who are you to tell us what to do, how to do? They try to crush him. They couldn't shoo him away. He would not go away. He said, "You don't want to be with me? I'll do it myself." And he did it himself. And he galvanized whatever forces he needed to bring about, and he did it. So you see a picture. He had a picture when he was born in this house. It was taken 1921. He was maybe 3 months old. And then you see fast forward to the end of his life, and you see what he looked like. Didn't necessarily look Jewish, but what was he? I envy the dead over the living. That's the reality. So he was a board member of Transamerica Insurance Company. So at the end of when he retired in the 70s from Transamerica, they made a video of his lifetime, a life. They spent a fortune of money putting out this video. And at the last convention of the Transamerica, they showed his video. And it showed him from time they had somebody, an actor, looked just like him, very similar, and how he lived through the roaring 20s and how he went to university and how he was a runner on the team, University of St. Louis, and he was a shot put person all the way straight through. And at the end of his life, he's dressed in a tuxedo with polka dots, tuxedo with his red beret, and he waves off everybody, and he goes out, and that's the end of the story. So what's perfection? So I'm just saying, when he passed away, he passed away in St. Louis, he was buried in Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. People came to his funeral. People you wouldn't believe. You wouldn't identify one with the other, heads of yeshivas, this and that. What are they doing there? And what they said about him. If they wouldn't have said it, you wouldn't know who he was. I envy the dead over the living. That's the story we're talking. So what's perfection? To achieve, maximize on opportunity, and don't leave a stone unturned, and do whatever you have to do. He was a man, 80% of his earnings, he gave to charity. You walk into his house, he looked like a regular middle-class person. He drove a regular car. He could afford an imported luxury car. Never. Because he said, if I could give the difference to charity, I'm giving it to charity. I'm not buying the car. And if I could do this, I'm not wasting money on this. That's the way he lived his life. Everything was evaluated, calculated, and was my mother-in-law happy about it? She wasn't so happy about it. Here, everybody's living high on the hog, and she's living, well, you have to be careful. When we buy furniture, it should be this, not more than that, because the house should be presentable to accommodate people, to host people. More than that, we don't need that. We don't need the Taj Mahal here. And that's where he lived his life. No, off.